Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. Sometimes real life is more unsettling than any fiction, and this case is a chilling reminder of that. Mike and Susan Royschel looked like the perfect couple. He was a successful entrepreneur, and she was a confident woman with a striking presence. From the outside, their lives seemed like a picture of stability, a luxury home, comfort, social events. But beneath that polished exterior was a reality few could have imagined. The truth began to emerge after one evening in February, when a disturbing call was placed to emergency services. What followed were revelations that painted a much darker picture: unnoticed messages, offhand remarks, drops of blood. Each detail added to a complex and deeply unsettling puzzle. Mike Royschel had money and connections. He and Susan were regularly seen at upscale venues and luxury resorts. To the outside world, they were the portrait of success, living in a high-end neighborhood in Naplesville, Florida, with a meticulously maintained yard, a private pool, and elegant decor. Everything about them suggested comfort and control. Susan, many believed, was a vibrant and fitting partner for Mike's status. But inside their home, a very different story was unfolding. Hidden tensions, unresolved issues, and a level of stress that couldn't stay concealed forever. Professionally, Mike had built a solid reputation. His business acumen was well known, but very few knew much about his personal history. He had once been married to a woman named Didi Hoffman. They met at the University of Florida when Mike was 19 and just starting his career. Their relationship began as a typical college romance and grew into a long-lasting marriage that spanned 25 years. According to Didi, Mike was calm, reliable, and not prone to aggressive behavior. But as his business expanded, so did his time away from home. Business trips, long hours, which slowly drove a wedge between him and his family. By 2005, they parted ways quietly, without any legal battles or public conflict. Though the memories of that earlier life stayed with him, it wasn't long before someone new entered the picture. Susan was a nurse, and they connected through an online dating site. She was 38 at the time. From their first messages, Mike was intrigued. She struck him as energetic, self-assured, and optimistic. Their conversations quickly developed into a committed relationship. Eventually, Susan moved in, stepping into the role once held by Didi. By August 2007, they were officially married. The house that had once belonged to Mike's first family now became the backdrop of his new life with Susan. On the morning of February 3, 2018, peace at the Royschel residence was shattered. Mike called emergency services, his voice noticeably shaken, reporting that someone in a mask had broken into their home with a knife. According to his account, the intruder had attacked both him and Susan. Police and medical responders arrived quickly, but what they discovered at the scene was far more serious than anyone could have imagined. From the outside, everything looked untouched: well-kept lawn, quiet street, the familiar front of a well-off home. But behind those large windows, signs of a deeply troubling incident were waiting to be uncovered. It was clear that this wasn't just a case of simple home intrusion. What lay inside required immediate and thorough investigation. Despite the seemingly stable image of their marriage, people close to the couple had started to notice things weren't as perfect as they appeared. After getting married, Susan had left her job. She'd previously worked as a hospice nurse, caring for the critically ill. She turned her full attention to managing the household and took control over nearly every domestic detail. Susan was known for her assertive and commanding demeanor. Mike, for his part, adapted to the changes. He cut back on business travel and even purchased a dental clinic to stay closer to home. Still, the mood within the house grew more strained, and over time the tension became increasingly noticeable. What once looked like a strong partnership began to show cracks. Mike confided in friends that he hoped to build something meaningful with Susan. But his efforts to foster a close connection often met a cold reception. Susan kept an emotional distance that was hard to ignore. When officers began combing through the home after the incident, they picked up on subtle details no one had noticed before. A picture began to emerge, one that suggested the household had been under silent pressure for quite some time. Tensions Mike hadn't shared even with those closest to him. The investigation was only just beginning. Who was the intruder? Why this house? Was it random, or the result of something long brewing within the family? To understand what had happened, detectives needed to revisit the events of the recent past. By 2015, things between Mike and Susan had clearly deteriorated. One of the most visible signs was Susan's relationship with Mike's daughters, especially his eldest, Caroline. Susan didn't hide her dislike for Caroline, and, in moments of frustration, would text Mike with sharp comments about her. What bothered Susan most was how much time Mike spent with his daughter. Caroline, for her part, strongly opposed her father's new wife. She believed Susan was trying to push her out of Mike's life. According to Caroline, Susan frequently consumed alcohol. 5 or 6 glasses of wine or martinis in an evening wasn't unusual. And yet, despite the amount, Susan remained composed and capable of holding a conversation. By fall 2017, the atmosphere in the household had grown especially tense. Things came to a head when Caroline began planning her wedding. Mike wanted the celebration to be a grand event and immediately agreed to fund it with $100,000. While that was already a large sum, Susan reluctantly agreed. But as the preparations continued, the budget expanded, and by the time everything was finalized, the costs had exceeded $250,000. Susan was furious. Even though she participated in the planning and tried to keep the peace, her resentment grew, especially after learning just how much Mike had ultimately spent. About 3 weeks after Caroline's wedding, Mike's oldest daughter heard something from her father that left her deeply concerned. He confided that Susan had physically lashed out at him more than once. Caroline believed him immediately. She had noticed a white scar on his face during the wedding. Mike confirmed her suspicion and even showed her photos of injuries he had taken after one of the incidents. In one case, he claimed Susan had come at him with a knife. That encounter ended with her being taken into custody by local authorities. It remained unclear whether that was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of aggressive behavior. The tension hit a breaking point after Susan learned the actual cost of Caroline's wedding. When she realized the total had gone beyond $250,000, she reacted with extreme hostility. She screamed at Mike, hurled a phone at him, and began to physically assault him. Her outburst shocked even those who had been aware of the couple's ongoing issues. Although she had been the one to start the confrontation, Susan was the one who called the police. It's believed she may have wanted to frame the narrative and be the first to explain what had happened. But things didn't go her way. When officers arrived, they found clear evidence of a physical altercation: damaged phone, a room in disarray, furniture knocked over. Both Mike and Susan were visibly distressed. Susan's account was confused and inconsistent, while Mike appeared emotionally worn down. After speaking with them, officers suggested Susan leave the house temporarily to allow things to cool off. She agreed, but didn't follow through. Once the police left, thinking the situation had de-escalated, Susan remained in the home and tried to convince Mike to reconcile. That evening, the couple went out to dinner, hoping to have a calm conversation. Mike viewed it as a chance to reconnect. But the dinner quickly spiraled. The subject shifted to a sore point: Caroline and the wedding expenses. Susan was convinced that the more attention Mike gave his daughter, the less space there was for her in his life. This caused constant friction and feelings of rivalry. The talk turned into another argument. Mike eventually stood up, left cash for the bill, and walked out of the restaurant. Susan stayed behind, replaying the confrontation in her mind. A while later, she sent Mike a message saying she planned to file for divorce. Another message followed, this time blaming his daughter for driving a wedge between them. Then she hailed a cab and went home. The house was quiet. Susan went into one of the rooms, trying to figure out her next move. Not long after, Mike returned. His demeanor had shifted. He was agitated, visibly upset. They began to argue again, and the argument escalated into a physical struggle. At some point, Susan felt a sharp pain. She realized she had been stabbed. In shock, she tried to push Mike away and end the confrontation, but was struck again. The aggression was swift and unexpected. Realizing she was in serious danger, Susan desperately tried to de-escalate. She began saying whatever she thought might calm him down. She promised not to go through with the divorce, not to leave him. She hoped those words would shift the course of what was happening. For a moment, Mike paused. Then, seemingly trying to take control of the situation, he put the knife away, began packing a bag, and proposed staging a break-in. He told her they'd tell the police that a masked stranger had broken into the house. He insisted she stick to this story and back him up when questioned. Susan agreed to go along with Mike's version of events because, at that moment, she felt she had no other option. But once she was taken to the hospital and realized she was safe, she immediately told the truth about what had happened. The next several hours were tense. Officers were in constant communication, doctors monitored Susan's condition, and the initial rounds of interviews began. Susan gave statements not only to medical personnel, but also to investigators, speaking openly about the events of that night. Meanwhile, Mike stuck to his story. A masked stranger had broken into the house and attacked them. To support his claims, he deleted footage from the home's security cameras, likely an attempt to erase any trace of what had really occurred. When police revisited the house for a second inspection, they found no signs of forced entry. All windows and doors were intact, and the locks hadn't been tampered with. This immediately raised doubts about Mike's version. He responded by suggesting the doors may have been left unlocked, giving someone easy access during the night. On the surface, it sounded plausible, and for a short time, investigators considered the possibility. But soon, surveillance footage from the restaurant where Mike and Susan had dined that evening surfaced. The video clearly showed them leaving separately, avoiding each other and not speaking. Once they returned home, they went into separate rooms. These visuals contradicted the idea of an outside intruder and raised even more questions. As more facts came to light, the investigation began pointing away from a random attack and toward a domestic conflict that had spiraled out of control. Mike's account seemed less and less credible. Despite his insistence, the statements, physical evidence, and footage were beginning to reveal a very different narrative. Behind the calm exterior of their home was a situation far more volatile than anyone had imagined. These new developments shifted the direction of the entire case. After Mike Royschel was arrested, his first move was to call his daughter. In his call to Caroline, he urgently tried to convince her of his innocence. He spoke with determination, asking her to contact his attorney and help him. He made it clear that her support could be critical to how he was perceived both legally and publicly. For Mike, Caroline was the one person whose opinion might truly sway the outcome of his case. But everything that had happened over the previous weeks didn't align with the image of the Mike people knew. A composed, successful businessman with a solid reputation. News of his arrest spread quickly. It wasn't just a topic of family discussion anymore. It was on the lips of coworkers, friends, and even his ex-wife. Those who had known Mike for years were stunned. Dee Dee, who had spent 25 years by his side, admitted she couldn't reconcile this version of events with the man she knew. She described Mike as kind, balanced, and never prone to aggression. To her, the idea of him being involved in such a serious incident felt impossible. Others echoed her view, describing Mike as logical and calm, even in high-stress situations. That made it all the more shocking that he now stood at the center of such grave allegations. The prosecution's case was direct. According to the district attorney, Mike couldn't handle the prospect of divorce and the potential loss of the wealth he had spent a lifetime building. He viewed it as an existential threat. Facing emotional pressure, he made a decision that, based on the investigation, led to the act of aggression. Prosecutors argued that Mike saw the division of assets as unacceptable and tried to resolve the issue in the most extreme way. Now, the defense had the difficult job of convincing the court that what happened was the result of an outside attack. According to Mike's lawyers, Susan's injuries were not the outcome of deliberate harm, but of an unintended chain of events. They maintained that the intruder theory remained the most reasonable explanation. At the first court hearing, held in mid-February, Mike publicly shared his account of what had happened for the first time. He confirmed that on the evening of February 2nd, he and Susan had a heated argument at a restaurant. They returned home separately and went to their respective rooms. According to Mike, after some time passed, he calmed down and decided to go to the guest room to make peace. There, he claimed, he found Susan kneeling by the bed, holding a knife. She appeared highly distressed, and Mike said he was afraid she might harm herself. He explained that he tried to convince Susan to put the knife down, but she refused. What followed, he said, was more of an emotional struggle than a violent one. Mike claimed that during the scuffle, the knife accidentally grazed her abdomen. He himself sustained cuts when the knife slipped from her hands. From his perspective, it was a tragic accident that occurred during his attempt to stop Susan from engaging in self-harm. But Mike's story quickly began to show cracks. He claimed that after the incident, the two sat on the bed and talked for a long time about their plans, vacations, and the future. He described it as one of their most heartfelt conversations in recent memory. That detail raised eyebrows. The idea that two people, injured and covered in blood, would sit calmly discussing travel plans felt far-fetched to investigators and courtroom observers alike. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. According to police reports, traces of blood weren't limited to the bed. They were also found on the floor, walls, and the bathroom mirror. Investigators also documented the presence of vomit and human waste, which made the scene especially grim. Mike could not provide a convincing explanation for these findings. All of it clashed with his narrative of a brief, accidental altercation, and instead suggested a far more intense episode. During the hearing, Mike also mentioned that their dog jumped onto the bed at one point, briefly distracting him. It was then, he claimed, that Susan grabbed the knife again and cut her wrists. She was crying and said she was terrified of going to jail and didn't know how to handle everything. Mike testified that at that moment, he realized he had to act to keep the situation from spiraling further. He turned off the home's security cameras to prevent any recordings of the incident and later contacted emergency services, reporting a break-in by an unknown intruder. But his account began to crumble when investigators cross-checked his statements with recovered surveillance footage. Despite his efforts to delete the videos, some clips had been saved. The footage showed a tense atmosphere in the house even before the incident. No signs of a break-in or an unknown person entering the property were found. This directly contradicted Mike's version of events. Forensic reports revealed that Susan's injuries had not been random. The knife wounds were deliberate and clean, not the result of a chaotic struggle. The evidence of aggressive behavior that Mike had tried to downplay suggested that while a confrontation did take place, it was not aimed at preventing self-harm. Given these findings, the court began to view the prosecution's theory as the more plausible one. The story of a masked intruder was falling apart. Additional questioning only strengthened that impression. The atmosphere in the courtroom became increasingly tense. Mike's attorneys attempted to reframe the narrative, portraying him as someone trapped in a toxic relationship. They referenced Susan's prior arrest for domestic aggression and submitted text messages from her phone containing threats and accusations against Mike. The defense's strategy focused on depicting Mike not as an aggressor, but as someone under extreme pressure who acted in self-defense. However, mounting evidence suggested the events of that night stemmed from a conflict that escalated into physical aggression, and that Mike's account didn't fully align with the facts. One of the key elements of Mike's defense strategy centered on his anonymous posts in online forums, where he shared personal stories with other men who claimed to have experienced domestic aggression. In those posts, Mike described his home life as a constant source of stress and conflict. He complained about Susan's frequent accusations of infidelity, even though there was no evidence, and said she demanded he cut ties with his daughter. The defense used these posts to argue that Mike was living in an emotionally damaging relationship and could have been the target of an assault himself. This version gained some traction. Susan's own messages included troubling statements. She wrote about feeling hopeless, mentioned thoughts of self-harm, and admitted she didn't know how to cope with her situation. Mike's legal team presented these texts as evidence that Susan might have staged an incident in order to pressure her husband. However, Susan's legal team took a firm stance in response. She denied all accusations of aggressive behavior and posed several direct questions to the court. If Mike was truly the victim, why didn't he contact law enforcement? Why didn't he leave a relationship he described as terrifying? And why, if he was focused on the truth, did he invent a story about a masked intruder? These questions were powerful because they highlighted inconsistencies in Mike's actions and called his credibility into question. To strengthen their case, Mike's attorneys brought in a forensic analyst who had examined the blood evidence found in the guest room. The analyst concluded that the pattern and angle of the blood splatter suggested the injuries occurred around 3 a.m. This timeline aligned with Mike's testimony and conflicted with Susan's, who said the incident happened closer to midnight while she was asleep. Forensic medical experts also testified that cuts of that nature on the wrists could lead to fatal blood loss within an hour if untreated. The fact that Susan survived, the defense argued, supported Mike's version that the injuries occurred shortly before emergency services were called. But soon, serious concerns about the forensic expert's credibility emerged. It was revealed that his professional license had previously been temporarily suspended due to ethics violations. Worse, he had been implicated in a criminal case involving the illegal possession of human remains. Authorities had discovered human organs, including hearts and a brain, in his personal refrigerator. These revelations seriously undermined his credibility and cast doubt on all his conclusions in this case. Susan's legal team responded immediately. Her attorneys argued that the blood spatter patterns clearly indicated a series of deliberate knife strikes, not accidental or self-inflicted wounds. According to them, Mike maintained full control during the confrontation, preventing Susan from defending herself. In court, Susan demonstrated how, as she claimed, Mike placed the knife in her hand to make it appear as though she had harmed herself, and then inflicted wounds on his own body to support his version of a mutual struggle. Additional findings from the investigation only deepened the doubts surrounding Mike's story. It was uncovered that months before the incident, Mike had been actively messaging women on dating platforms. He wasn't just chatting, he was making plans for a future that clearly didn't include Susan. These messages became a critical point in Susan's defense, showing that Mike had already emotionally checked out of the marriage and had misled everyone by claiming he was trying to save it. The prosecution argued that the attack wasn't spontaneous. It was a calculated attempt to remove Susan from the picture and avoid the financial fallout of divorce. As evidence, they cited Mike's actions, deleting footage from the home's security cameras, filing a false report about an intruder, and attempting to create a convincing alibi. The defense insisted these moves were simply ways for Mike to retain control over the situation and protect his assets. But with each passing day, his story started to unravel. New evidence contradicted his claims, and his explanations lost credibility. What initially looked like a common domestic dispute soon revealed itself to be something far more serious, a case with clear signs of intentional harm. As the trial progressed, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and witnesses presented conflicting interpretations, but each hearing uncovered new details that had been hidden behind the polished exterior of a seemingly successful marriage. Years of unresolved tension had finally erupted. What began as a disagreement over dinner escalated into one of the most closely followed court cases in recent memory. Mike Royschel, once a respected and well-established figure in the business world, found himself at the center of a criminal trial, accused of attempting to take the life of his own wife. Investigators believed his fear of losing assets in a divorce pushed him to the breaking point. That fear, they claimed, became the catalyst for everything that followed. The jury listened carefully, weighing every argument, every piece of testimony. It took them just 4 hours to reach a decision. Mike was found guilty on multiple counts: attempted murder, tampering with evidence, failure to provide assistance, and witness intimidation. In December 2019, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The verdict was firm and decisive. Mike never admitted guilt. He appealed the ruling, but the appeal was denied. He remains incarcerated at a correctional facility in Florida, with little to no chance of early release. Still, interest in the case didn't fade. Not long after his conviction, rumors surfaced suggesting Mike had attempted to find someone who could harm Susan even from behind bars. While these claims prompted a police investigation, authorities couldn't gather enough evidence to press new charges. Nonetheless, the rumors further damaged his already broken reputation. Susan, for her part, filed for divorce immediately after Mike's arrest. She pushed for a swift resolution and declined all media requests. Her only goal was to finalize the legal proceedings and move on with her life. However, one unresolved matter lingered: the house where the incident took place. For Susan, it wasn't just property, it was the site of both the rise and fall of her marriage. Despite the traumatic memories, she stood firm in her claim to a share of the estate. Mike, through his legal team, attempted to contest her claims, arguing she wasn't entitled to a portion of the property. The dispute continued, even as he served his sentence. For Susan, the fight over the house was less about money and more about closure. To her, it symbolized the end of a dark chapter she was determined to leave behind. Although Susan ultimately prevailed in court, it was difficult to call it a victory. Mike was convicted, but she lost her sense of security and trust. The life she once knew was gone. Mike, once surrounded by wealth, freedom, and respect, now spends his days in a solitary cell, cut off from everything he once had. At its core, this case wasn't just about financial disagreements or personal drama. It was a chilling example of how unaddressed conflict, a need for control, and a refusal to resolve issues constructively can spiral into disaster. Lies, cover-ups, and manipulation destroyed both of their lives. Mike paid with his freedom, and Susan with her peace of mind. This story doesn't offer easy answers. Who suffered more? Who was truly at fault? These questions continue to spark debate. But one thing is clear: the consequences were irreversible for everyone involved. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.